So I would just like to start with a little show of hands to activate you a little bit. Could you please show your hand if you know the person in the right-hand corner? It's down there. Very good, very well educated audience, that's excellent. Could you also raise your hand if you happen to know the person in the top left corner? Not that many hands. Well, please meet Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard. He works for NATO. On 20 October of last year, he ordered NATO fighter jets to attack a military convoy in Libya consisting of approximately 150 vehicles. He wanted to split up the convoy. During that attack, Colonel Gaddafi, got injured and eventually died from his wounds. Please note that it was not President Obama who ordered the attack, or even Nicolas Sarkozy. It was a NATO commander at the NATO headquarters. On the lower right-hand side, you might recognize Laurent Gbagbo. He was the former president of Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast. He had been president for 10 years, but he lost the election in November 2010. He, however, didn't want to leave. He sat in his office, he decided to remain president, which led to a couple of months of civil war in Côte d'Ivoire. Now, on 10 April 2011, the man on the lower left-hand side, Alain Leroy, Deputy Undersecretary General for Peacekeeping Operations at the United Nations, decided that time was up. He ordered UN helicopters to attack the residence of the then President Gbagbo. President Gbagbo was arrested the next day on 11 April and is currently sitting in The Hague awaiting trial for the International Criminal Tribunal. What I'm interested in my research is why sovereign states like the United States, China, Germany, Costa Rica delegate such important tasks to military officers and civil servants in NATO, in the United Nations and other international organizations. Why do they do that? And I'm also interested when and under which conditions these civil servants in international secretariats exert influence over sovereign states. Now, if you have listened carefully to the previous presentation, I'm sure you have, you will notice the similarities. We're effectively talking about a similar topic. The previous presentation from a law perspective, me from a political science perspective. And if there's still some economists in the room left, they will notice a principal-agent model here. A model invented in the economic discipline, and I'm now using it for my research in political science, so talking about multidisciplinarity. Over the last 4 years, in the context of my dissertation, I've looked at the European Union as a security organization. So I've researched why do sovereign states delegate tasks to the European Union when it comes to security, and also when do EU officials exert influence in the field of security. Later this year, I will start a new research project in which I expand the domain of my research to the United Nations and to NATO. By looking at more international organizations, I hope to get a better overview of really the reasons of sovereign states to delegate and when international secretariats exert influence. This research will be funded by the European Union. Now let me just go a bit into the type of research I'm doing. And I will be first looking at my first research question, delegation, and afterwards I go into the influence of secretariats. What I'm doing, my research strategy, is to study very carefully moments of delegation. Moments when states are sitting around the table, like during the Maastricht Treaty, just across the river in 1991. I'm studying how they're sitting on the table and what are their motivations. What are the type of discussions are they having? What are the arguments they're bringing forward to give tasks to Brussels, to Europe, or not to give tasks to Europe? And I carefully study in this respect negotiation positions of member states. Member states often circulate documents of what they exactly want in terms of delegation, and I'm looking at those reasons. I'm studying preparatory reports, the European Convention leading up to the Lisbon Treaty, and so forth. I interview high-level civil servants, people who are closely involved. For some older episodes, I read memoirs from leading politicians describing the consideration at that stage. And of course, I also have a look at the newspapers of the day. And as some sort of a detective, I'm going through all these documents and I'm trying to code what are the reasons, what type of reasons do they bring forward. And I will just give you some results now relating to my European Union research. I obviously can't say anything yet on what I'm going to do in the future. I noticed that there are two very important considerations that come up time and again. Efficiency and sovereignty. And these two considerations are a trade-off. Going back to these military commanders from the start of my presentation, member states realize that such important decisions have to be quick. So they realize that it's good to have one person in charge who takes these decisions for them. You can't do war making by committee. You can't sit around the table of 27 or 28 member states and think, are we going to attack a military convoy or not? It's more efficient to delegate that task to one person. So that's the type of considerations that are being made. And to my surprise, in doing that research, those considerations are very explicit. In all kinds of official documents, member states really balance between these things. But on the other hand, the sovereignty. You can give the power, say, to one military commander, but how do you know that that military commander is actually going to do what you want them to do? And member states are very conscious of this fact. And because they're conscious of the fact that the military commander might do something different than they want them to do, they decide not to delegate. They prefer to keep tasks in their own hand. And this is a very nice balance, which you see time and again. And the consequence of this balance is pretty important. Namely, delegation is a suboptimal process. Institutional outcomes in international organizations are never fully efficient. One example that plays a lot these days is the European Bailout Fund. Every day I read in the newspaper economists saying that the bailout fund is not enough, that it's not efficient. But unfortunately, we have something as politics and people who actually want to keep, in this case the Germans, the money in their own pockets, want to keep the right to decide what to do with their own money themselves. They don't want to delegate that to Europe. And that's very important, suboptimal outcomes. Very often, international institutions are as a result rather inefficient. But fortunately, really fortunately, states learn. Their feedback effects. They take negative experiences into account to improve the machinery. So that are the moments of delegation. Why do member states delegate? I just shortly want to say something about the influence of secretariats, my second research question. How do I research that again? What I do is I'm using case studies. In my PhD, I looked at 2 military operations of the European Union, military operation in Bosnia and a military operation in Eastern Chad. And I looked at 2 civilian operations, rule of law missions, police missions, monitoring missions, of the EU in Aceh, that's Indonesia, and of the EU in Kosovo. The Kosovo operation is still ongoing, it's very, very big, and you read quite a bit about it in the newspapers. And for all these case studies, I looked at how does an operation come on the agenda, how are decisions being made, and how is the operation being implemented. And I look at the contribution and the influence of secretariats and international civil servants in this respect. In terms of data, I rely to a large extent on interviews. I go to Brussels, I go to the EU institutions, I meet people there, and I ask for them what happened at that moment in time. Could you tell me something about it? I have all these interviews. Again, you write them out, a lot of work, and then you code it, you use official documents to compare it, and yet again, as some sort of a detective, I try to trace the whole process from the beginning to the end. So, 4 operations, 105 interviews, and then tracing the process. In a way, I came to 2 important findings regarding the influence of secretariats. Secretariats are particularly strong in agenda setting, in the very beginning of military operations. They are at the heart of the process. They have a central position in the machinery. And as a result, they're very good at putting things on the agenda and making sure that it stays down there. My second finding is that secretariats have a lot more influence when it comes to innovative issues that haven't been done before than when it comes to things that have standard operating procedures and that are being done all the time. For example, secretariats, the EU Secretariat had much more influence in sending judges to Kosovo to do rulings in Kosovo about Kosovo issues, so sending EU judges to Kosovo and deal with things, than to send military guys to Chad and Bosnia. Sending military personnel abroad, we've been doing for a very long time. Sending judges to a third country to actually practice law down there is something of the 21st century. It's very new, it's very innovative. There are no benchmarks, there are no standing operating procedures, so a lot of it has to be invented, and that's where secretariats maneuver themselves through. So to come to a conclusion, my work in my PhD and in the future projects I'm doing are guided by 2 research questions. Why do states delegate? Sovereign states which don't want to give tasks away. And secondly, when do international secretariats like the EU, NATO, United Nations exert influence in security issues? I've initially looked at the EU, and now I'm broadening my research. And this is particularly relevant because at the moment, military deployments are reaching record levels. There are about 250,000 soldiers internationally carrying out operations from Afghanistan to Congo, to Darfur, South Sudan at the moment, Haiti. These are really record levels, 250,000 soldiers, and I would like to know a bit more about that. Thank you very much for your attention. Forward to your questions.
Thank you, Hylke. Over there. Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences.
I'm Ryan Wilder from that faculty. Hylke, thanks for your presentation. I have a question on this learning issue, because I think that's crucial. You just explained to us that, you know, solutions on the institutional level are always suboptimal, but the optimistic side of that you have feedback loops and that we can learn. How is that learning actually organized? Because every 4 years you have elections, you have new politicians, and you just told us in your second case that if civil servants, maybe they're still there, but they are only relevant if we deal with new kind of issues. So how is really this learning cycle institutionalized, and can you also see differences between organizations where it works more perfectly or less imperfect than in other cases?
Thank you very much for your question. I have to still do my research on the United Nations, but I just kept one slide. I mean, it's very preliminary research behind, because I think it's rather interesting, and it points at learning effects. On the left-hand side, in blue, is the number of troops that the United Nations has sent abroad per year. So this is just the United Nations. And on the right-hand side, in red, you see the number of civil servants working in New York on security issues. What we see very clearly in this slide is that after the end of the Cold War, the number of peacekeepers exploded, really fundamentally. Operation in Bosnia particularly was very big. The United Nations sent about 60,000 troops to Bosnia. It also sent troops to Somalia, and it sent troops to Rwanda. 3 major operations. Now what happened in 1994, 1995, effectively the UN was incapable at all of bringing the war in Bosnia to a close. The UN had to withdraw from Somalia. You might remember the American movie which was made about that, Black Hawk Down. And the UN had to withdraw from Rwanda while genocide was taking place at that time. So 1994, 1995, you see the sharp decline. And at that moment, because of these negative experiences, a tremendous learning process started. And one of the consequences, I think that the learning process is still continuing, is that the United Nations has said, we need more staff at headquarters. We need more efficient structures at headquarters. And one thing I still rather can't believe is the extreme correlation, extremely high correlation between deployments and staff at headquarters after, say, 1997. It's very, very high. And this remains, again, very preliminary research, but that's, for me, an example of a learning moment. Now, and what I want to do, and I'm starting later this year, you can be sure that 1994, 1995 will be a crucial focus point for my research. I will have to go very in-depth in what happened, who creates this learning process, and so forth. But it's generally at a rather high political level. At a political level, people understand things go wrong. We have to improve the situation here. Thank you for your question.
Other questions or remarks? Over there, in the front row. One mic, it's okay.
Aniek de Bruin, FHML. I have a question about the methodology you use, because it's really important to get the true reasons for why they do this. And on the one hand, people might not be aware why they do it. They're not going to say, well, it's more efficient, I would say so. On the other hand, they might not be willing to admit why they really do it. So how do you, well, just kind of get to really know the reasons through interviewing, through reading newspapers, for why they do make the decision to delegate these decisions?
I think that's a very good question, and I mean that's also part of the challenge of this type of qualitative research. I mean the starting point for me is always official documents, you know, things which are open in the domain to which you can easily refer and which other researchers can check as well. But at the end of the day, you generally have to go beyond it. You have to try to get your hands on internal papers from member states, and they're, well, reluctantly to give that, but fortunately quite a bit is available. And you have to try to gather all that data. But one of the things, and I was really amazed about that in my PhD, once you get your hands on these documents, you see almost explicit cost-benefit analyses that decision makers and that states make. You really see them, you know, balancing potential efficiency gains. If we would organize the EU like this, that would be better. On the other hand, we would have less control. They make those type of things. And what particularly is useful is preparatory work. You had that for the Maastricht Treaty, Amsterdam Treaty, the European Convention as well, because at the preparatory stage, member state delegates generally tend to disagree still. I mean, if they agree at the preparatory stage, it's already over. And their disagreements are noted down in reports and in minutes of these meetings. And that gives you a very good idea of the type of discussions that played between states. So actually, during my PhD, I've been rather surprised as well by seeing these arguments. I thought it would have been a lot more difficult than it actually was. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, over there.
So I have actually two questions. The first question was almost the same. I was also quite concerned about how you interview them. Also because I think that politicians, for example, they're thinking about the next vote, for example. They're not going to say, yeah, I didn't want to engage directly in a war myself just because I wanted to get re-elected. That's not something that they're going to say to you. Secondly, what I'm concerned about is one of the most optimal things is when you delegate to secretaries is that you can very easily legitimize the decision. As a single country, for example, take the United States, who would engage into a war with Iraq, you get in huge problems. When you do it through the UN, when you do it through the NATO, of course, it's completely different in the sense that it's the world that is doing it. You are not directly responsible, and in that sense, I think it's a very important optimal decision in that sense, because you don't get in problems, for example, with neighbor countries.
Thank you very much for your question. International organizations indeed play a very big legitimizing function to which you're referring, and that's one of the reasons indeed for delegation. This holds particularly true for the United Nations. I mean, one of the roles of the United Nations Security Council is to provide legitimacy to military operations. But a lot of people also tend to think that now NATO gives a legitimizing function. For France, for the United Kingdom, a bit less, to a lesser extent to the United States, but that's true. Going back to your first question, I mean, first of all, interviews, and I mean that's one of the negative aspects of my research. I'm not disclosing interviewee sources, so they can tell to me what they want, and they're obviously a bit more frank than if they're on the record. Particularly civil servants cannot be on the record. I mean, this is just the first condition of talking to them. So I mean that partially helps, but it also helps in terms of the if you think about the way of doing interviews, and I mean a lot of handbooks and literature has been written on how to conduct interviews, and my strategy is really to let them describe things. I don't ask for their opinion. I ask them to describe things. For example. When did you first get involved with the NATO operation in Libya? What was your role at that time? Descriptive questions, and then you get, ideally, some sort of an overview from their perspective of what happened. You talk to a lot of people, you don't talk to one person on one issue, and you try to reconcile the different stories. So I'm not asking a politician for comment. So that wouldn't be my strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. One last question, maybe? Yes, over here, please.
Yes, Sibran Schrim van der Loof from the economics faculty. As an econometrician, I wouldn't be worth my salt if I didn't have any concerns about your graph that you make a lot of. You borrowed from economics, you say, in your principal agent problem. I suggest you read the article by Plosser and Nelson about trends. Obviously, here you have two trending series that correlate like hell, but it's a trend that correlate. That doesn't mean anything about there being any relationship between the two. What I would be really impressed, Plosser and Nelson actually showed was a shaming moment in economics or econometrics. They showed that a lot of the macroeconomic models that were published until then did so well, not because there was any inherent causality or something in there, but because of the trending correlating. So predictions from those models worked poorly, merely because there wasn't any real law connecting them. And what I would be impressed about, if you first difference those data, and you still got a correlation, high correlation. Differencing is detrending them. Okay, that's my remark that I had to make. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you very much. I mean, as politicians, we learn a lot from economists, particularly econometricists. So I definitely take your comment on board. I mean, just a few quick points. My data set is very limited here because I have data in terms of staff for once a year. And I have the, so 1990, so 21 observations. I have the whole population. I mean, that speaks to the advance. But I don't use this to predict, say, what's going to happen in 2012. As a matter of fact, I'm rather skeptical about these figures as well. I think actually that, I mean, the lines are so closely connected from 1997 that I would expect almost there to be a document somewhere in the United Nations that says per 150 troops that we send abroad, we need one person at headquarters. I don't think that such document exists, but there must be something like a norm out there. And I mean, I'm gonna look for that, and that would then create, say, the relationship that you're talking about. But I wouldn't say that this relationship is completely out of the blue. I mean, if you run bigger missions, you need bigger support staff. That's pretty obvious to me. But I will look further into these lines and the trend. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hylke Dijkstra, ladies and gentlemen.